Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your in-depth look at how news from Taiwan is impacting the world. I'm Rick Lowett. Chinese President Xi Jinping had reportedly received criticism from party elders prior to China's annual leadership meeting this year. China's economy is faltering and decades of societal issues remain unresolved. Commentators fear that worsening living standards in China could lead to further repression from the central government. And worse, this repression could spill over beyond Chinese borders. To understand the situation on the ground, I spoke with activist and writer Benedict Rogers. He spent 30 years visiting China, reporting on the human rights crackdowns there. We began by discussing whether freedom and democracy in China have come to their lowest point in decades.
When I first went to China when I was 18 years old to teach English in Qingdao, although it was only 3 years after the Tiananmen Square massacre, there was a sense, nevertheless, that China was starting to open up. And of course, I wasn't under any illusions about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party and its repression. Nevertheless, there was a certain space within limitations to do certain things, to have certain conversations. And that space grew, I think, over the years that I traveled around China, really until Xi Jinping's leadership, or perhaps a few years before Xi Jinping. And over the last decade under his leadership, I would say, from a human rights perspective, it's the worst time in decades.
And do you have an example of just how bad things are there at the moment that you'd like to share with us?
Somewhere around 2009 or 10, I was in Beijing, and at that time I met a group of Chinese human rights lawyers who, despite the restrictions on civil society, nevertheless had some space, and they described the space to me, some space to defend human rights cases. And there was quite a movement of Chinese human rights lawyers at that time. A few years later, there was a real crackdown on them. Many of those lawyers that I met then in a restaurant in Beijing subsequently, a few years later, disappeared, were jailed, were disbarred, and that whole movement of Chinese human rights lawyers was dismantled.
And why do you think things are so bad when it comes to human rights and democracy in China at the moment?
I think that somewhere around the late first decade of the 2000s, so sort of around the time of the Beijing Olympics in 2008, I think the party, first of all, felt that it had got from the outside world a lot, particularly the prestige of hosting the Olympics. And at the same time, I think they were concerned that they had perhaps allowed the space that had opened up within the country to become too large. And it was around the time of Liu Xiaobo and the Charter 08, and I think the party was spooked by that. I think the various color revolutions around the world also unnerved them, and I think they then decided it's time to crack down again. I think Xi Jinping then, of course, intensified and accelerated that, and has really applied it across the board, whether it's the crackdown on human rights across mainland China, the dismantling of Hong Kong's freedoms completely, intensified repression in Tibet, and of course the genocide of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang.
Obviously, it's hard for us to get hard data on China and its economic situation, but there are several indicators that economic growth is slowing down. How might this have an impact on human rights and freedom there?
Well, I think it will certainly lead to greater discontent among people. In a sense, the Chinese Communist Party had a kind of unwritten deal with the people of China that in exchange for China's economic miracle and increased living standards and prosperity, the party, would have a legitimacy, in inverted commas, in the eyes of the people. And I think now that economic miracle is failing and slowing, and at the same time the political repression has intensified, I think it will lead to people being more and more questioning about the party. What that looks like in practice and whether it results in more protests of the kind we saw last year after the COVID restrictions, time will tell. But I think definitely there will be more discontent.
So now you're here in Taiwan. Could you tell us in what ways people here are helping or supporting human rights activists, defenders in China?
I think Taiwan and Taiwan's voice internationally is really important because it is one of the most vibrant and successful democracies in the region. It shows that the narrative by the Chinese Communist Party that Chinese culture, Chinese people aren't ready for democracy, aren't suited to democracy, is a complete lie, because it's a very successful democracy in a Chinese-speaking culture here. So I think the world should listen to Taiwan and learn from it. And I think Taiwan has a role in speaking out for human rights elsewhere in the region.
What evidence have you seen here of how China can exert influence outside of its borders?
I haven't witnessed anything firsthand, I would say, but certainly it's come up in conversations, and particularly around cybersecurity, disinformation, and the sort of hybrid warfare tactics. And I think generally an awareness that Taiwan is approaching a very important period in the run-up to the presidential elections. And of course, the Chinese regime, I'm sure, will be looking at ways to try and influence and interfere with that.
So zooming out now, I know that you've spent a lot of time in the region, you've visited many other countries in Asia and looked at the situation there. Could you give us a sense of whether you feel human rights and democracy is backsliding in Asia?
I think obviously it's a mixed picture, because there are certain countries like Taiwan, Japan, Korea, and others that are successful democracies. But overall, I would say there's a lot of reasons to be concerned, and in certain places it's gone really backwards. One of the places that is worst is Myanmar, where for about a decade there was albeit very fragile, but nevertheless a period of some hope that Myanmar was turning a page, moving away from military dictatorship and into civilian-led democratic government, and that's all been reversed. The military have basically turned the clock back by a decade with the coup in 2021 and the appalling human rights crackdown since then. I mean, airstrikes against civilians, something like 20,000 political prisoners, dissidents who were executed last year, and real concerns about the health of Aung San Suu Kyi in prison. So Myanmar is certainly, not just for the region, but for the world, a real human rights crisis.
And could you tell us how China influences the region? Is it having a negative impact on the lives of people living in other Asian countries?
Definitely. I've actually just published a book called The China Nexus, which looks primarily at the human rights situation across China, but it also has chapters on China's relationship with the regime in Myanmar and the regime in North Korea. And I basically make the point in those two chapters that it is China almost single-handedly that is keeping those two really brutal, illegal regimes alive through providing a financial lifeline, militarily providing arms, and crucially providing diplomatic protection at the UN and in other international fora. So China is definitely a major obstacle to advancing human rights and democracy in those two countries and in others as well.
And how does a country, a democracy like Taiwan, fit into this? What can Taiwan do for countries like Myanmar?
Well, I think Taiwan can certainly do, it is already doing a lot, but I think it could certainly do more, particularly in terms of, for example, funding. Bodies like the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy are really important, and I think their role in supporting initiatives, activists, projects among civil society elsewhere in the region to get information out and to the attention of the international community. I think there are possibilities to fund training and to strengthen the capacity of civil society, and funding to strengthen international advocacy, because I think whether it's Myanmar or North Korea or other parts of the region, there is a need to keep these issues on the international agenda. I think the Taiwanese government can certainly speak out. I mean, obviously it's a bit more limited by the fact that it doesn't have a seat at the UN and is excluded from multilateral fora, but nevertheless it could still use its voice to speak out on human rights in the region.
And obviously you're based in the UK, in London. Could you tell us what you've witnessed when it comes to Chinese influence on that country?
Yeah, Chinese influence in the UK, I think, is very concerning, and it's felt in a variety of ways. If you look at the City of London, the financial world, China has a lot of influence there. It's got a particularly alarming influence in the university sector, both through the dependency that our universities have developed on Chinese students and student fees. I would never want to say that we shouldn't receive Chinese students, but I do think that we should perhaps do more to improve background checks, to look at sources of funding, to look at what disciplines Chinese students are coming to study, and are we unwittingly, in some cases, transferring knowledge that could eventually be used against us, particularly in the sciences and technology. There are universities that have research partnerships with bodies in China that are actually part of the People's Liberation Army, so directly involved in military research. And then there's the behavior of the Chinese regime in terms of threatening and intimidating particularly Hong Kongers, but also Uyghurs. And even I myself, what I've experienced pales into insignificance compared with what others have faced. But I've received threatening anonymous letters at my home address in London. My neighbours have received letters. Even my mother has received letters telling her to tell me to stop doing what I'm doing.
Are people in countries like the UK waking up to the threat that China poses?
Yes, I think people in London are certainly waking up to it. I think in Parliament there's been a real transformation from a few years ago where it was hard to find any voices speaking up to now, plenty of voices on all sides, in all parties. And in government, although I think there's more work to be done, I think government is also waking up to it. There's a focus, for example, on the issue of the secret Chinese police stations, the issue of Confucius institutes, and other examples. So yes, people are waking up, although I think it's been slow and it's rather late in the day, but people are waking up.
So you've been advocating for human rights in China and Asia for a while now. Is it becoming easier to make people care about these issues in the UK?
It's certainly become easier now than it was a few years ago. I remember in 2015, 2016, during the David Cameron government, when David Cameron had this, what was called the golden era of Sino-British relations. It was incredibly difficult at that time to get attention on human rights in China. The government didn't want to highlight human rights because they were totally focused on the business relationship with China. And I was quite a lone voice at that time. Now there are many others saying what I've been saying for many years. It's become a much more mainstream thing. There are friends in all political parties who are concerned. So it's a lot easier than it was.
That was activist and writer Benedict Rogers discussing the state of human rights in China. And this has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. You can find more stories from TaiwanPlus by following us on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
For more stories from Taiwan and around the world, follow us on social media or download the TaiwanPlus app.